will not always be on top and have not always been on top. That the white man on the so-called top has only been there for about 500 years out of the millions of years man has existed on this globe. And that the black man has been on top for thousands of years longer than the white man will ever know. But for people who don't know their own history, and for people who don't read history, for people who get their knowledge from cartoons and from sitcoms and from TV, you will never be aware of this. And so there are those among us, particularly those who live in America, who believe that since we live among the top white folk in the world, they will always stay on top and they will always hand us a crust of bread. There will always be welfare. And yet Clinton today is telling you that he's going to sweep you off of welfare after 2 years on it. And that one of the major programs that the Republicans are crying out for and other people are crying out for cutting are welfare programs. If you look at some of the states across this country, such as California, Michigan, and other states, you will see welfare programs and other what we call government transfer programs, where money is transferred from the government to people in poverty. They have been declining over the past decade or so. Poor people are getting poorer in America, not better in America. As a matter of fact, we have as many, if not more now, poor people in America as we had in the early 1970s. Poverty has actually increased and is increasing to the point of where we initiated a war on poverty at the end and the middle 1960s. When you look at the number of African American children in poverty, the number of African American children who live in poverty today is the same as the number that lived in poverty in 1949. Okay? And this is what you have to measure sometimes, by the way, when you look at statistics. Because some people want to say, well, you know, 2/3 of black folk are in the middle class. And 3/4 of black men are above the poverty level in earnings. But that's not the most important measure of where we are as African people. What you have to look at in terms of where you are as an African people are the number of children who are in poverty. You see? What number of children live in poverty-stricken circumstances? And when you live in poverty-stricken circumstances, you are not just living in an area where there is an absence of money. You're living in an area where there are absences all about you. You generally then will live in areas where there is a high level of criminality, high levels of drug addiction, high levels of prostitution and other things going on, poor educational opportunities, poor job opportunities, poor health care and other kinds of things. So when we say people are poor, we are not talking about people who just are lacking money. We're talking about people who are living under particular conditions that destroy the spirit, destroy the mind, destroy values, destroy outlooks, and continues to perpetuate poverty through the type of psychology that is ultimately inculcated in those people. And therefore, the more sensitive measure of the nature of where we are as a people are the number of our children who are living in poverty-stricken circumstances. So while we may talk about 1/3 or 2/3 of our people living above the so-called poverty line, we must recognize that almost 2/3 of our children are living under poverty-stricken circumstances, and that does not augur well for the race. Simply because you have something does not mean that you will keep it. And this is another error that many black people make. They think now because they got good jobs, or you think now because you may be living better, that the world, that this is going to continue. There's no universal law written in stone that because you're living well today, you're going to live better tomorrow. I frequently criticize this myth in America, this myth that we call the myth of progress, or the idea of progress, and that is that things get better with time, so that even if they're not the way we want them today, they will be better tomorrow. Who told you that lie? They could be worse tomorrow. people don't only progress in history, they regress in history. Empires not only are built and grow up in histories, empires do what? Fall and collapse in histories. You must understand that. So simply because you may have a higher level of opportunity today, simply because you may have a higher income today, in no way guarantees greater opportunity tomorrow or higher income tomorrow. So there are those who will look at this so-called progress that African Americans have achieved today and will assume then that this expansion will continue in the future. And yet a reading of our own history would demonstrate that that is not the case. This is not the first time black people voted. This is not the first time black people have gone to so-called integrated school. This is not the first time in the history of African Americans that you've had black mayors, that you've had black people sitting in the Congress of the United States, that you've had black people sitting in the Senate of the United States, that you've had black people head of corporations or living in white neighborhoods. You know the time that this occurred in this country? This same type of lifestyle occurred in the United States over 100 years ago in the 1870s. Back in the 1870s, black people were expecting to have a black president, a vice president elected anytime. You had black people in the 1870s proclaiming that the era of racism was over, that people would no longer be judged based on their race or background in the 1870s. But do you know what happened in the 1870s? Blacks were disenfranchised. The votes were taken away. Black people were thrown physically out of state legislatures. Black people were terrorized from the voting polls and were not allowed to vote. Black people who had been buried in graveyards beside white folk, they had their bodies dug up and shipped somewhere else. In other words, you see, because you are integrated doesn't mean you cannot become disintegrated. And it took then 100 years, up to the 1960s and 70s, for black people to re-achieve again the things they had 100 years before. So there is no guarantee that because you have some kind of opportunities today, or because you're making some kind of progress today, that that progress is guaranteed to you. Why were black people rejected and why were they disenfranchised? Because a group of white folk thought that it was in their interest that they be disenfranchised. And we are in exactly the same position today when there is a group of white folk in America today who come to believe seriously that it is in their interest to remove opportunities from black folk and to disenfranchise us, then it will happen. And ladies and gentlemen, it is on the verge of happening today. And we have to then keep this in mind. Why is this happening today? For one of the major reasons, it happened in the 1870s. Because in the 1870s, a part of the struggle also had to do with the economic nature of America. And America undergoing recession, and America undergoing depression, and America undergoing economic problems. And therefore, there was a need to readjust the racial status quo. And black people then were a part of that readjustment. We believe then, and this is what I was talking about earlier, we think then that whites will always be on top, and therefore their being on top is going to at least guarantee that we eat. That is a serious deception. I've talked before about the crisis of white supremacy. The fact now that there is a question as to whether whites will be the supreme race on this globe. There is beginning to be every likelihood that the Asian ethnic group will be the supreme ruling group on this globe, particularly if Africans are still listening to hip hop and still caught up in music and are still not caught up with the realities of what's going on. And I've often asked the question then, are we as African people struggling to gain our freedom from white domination only to fall under the domination of Asians? And that possibility is becoming more and more real